Welcome back to Geographics. I'm your host, cosmic horror author Eric Malachite, and today's script was provided by Radu Alexander, so be sure to show him some love in the comments as you deploy your likes, subscribe, and ring that bell, and share this video with someone who loves learning about the history behind the world's most iconic places. Let's get to it. I made an inquiry of those Spaniards who had been there, why this prince, chief, or king was called Dorado. They tell me that they have learned that the great lord or prince goes about continually covered in gold dust as fine as ground salt. He feels that it would be less beautiful to wear any other ornament. It would be crude and common to put on armor plates or hammered or stamped gold. For other rich lords wear these when they wish. But to powder oneself with gold is something exotic and unusually novel and more costly. For he washes away at night what he puts on each morning so that it is discarded and lost, and he does this every day of the year. Every morning he anoints himself with a kind of resin or gum to which the gold dust easily adheres, until his entire body is covered, from the soles of his feet to his head, so his looks are as resplendent as a gold object worked by the hands of a great artist. Those are the words of 16th century Spanish historian Oviedo, who gave the Western world the first insight into El Dorado, usually translated as the Gilded Man or the Gilded One. Originally, the term El Dorado was used to refer to the king of this magical land so rich in gold, but over time, it came to mean the city itself. If you know anything about Spanish conquistadors, it's that they became absolute lunatics when it came to gold. And no amount of danger or bloodshed would prevent them from getting their hands on it. Just ask the Aztecs or the Inca. Entire empires collapsed to sate the Spanish lust for gold. So when they heard about a city with so much gold that they used it as human panko, they needed to conquer it. And thus began the search for the mythical city of gold, El Dorado. While the story of El Dorado has been around for hundreds of years, and even today you can find people who believe it is still hidden somewhere in the Amazon jungle, the search for El Dorado can be focused mostly during the mid to late 16th century. We begin our tale in 1536, when an expedition of 800 soldiers led by Gonzalo Jimenez de Caseta left the port city of Santa Marta and marched inland to explore the unknown region that is modern-day Colombia. Following Francisco Pizarro's conquest of the Inca Empire, tales arose of other kingdoms that were even richer in gold than the Inca, and the Spanish were quite eager to find them. Under orders from Santa Marta Governor Pedro Fernandez de Lugo, Quesada was to explore the Magdalena River and see if any of the native tribes he would encounter had any gold. Technically speaking, the stated goal was to follow the river and see if it led to Peru, but he should also definitely be on the lookout for anything shiny. Quesada was ordered to take a diplomatic approach, be as peaceful, and only ask for as much gold as the indigenous people were willing to spare so that they remained friendly and gave more later. However, if this, dare we say, optimistic strategy failed, then Quesada was ordered to wage war of fire and blood on them. Great! With the plan established, the expedition began making its way to the Magdalena River, and almost immediately things went awry. The bulk of the army traveled overland, while a smaller contingent sailed the river in 6 brigs, carrying most of the provisions intending to rendezvous at the town of Tamalameque. However, only 2 of the 6 ships made it. Of the other 4, 2 got swept away and turned back, 1 wrecked but was rescued by friendly natives, and the most unfortunate one of all wrecked in cannibal territory, and its men became, if you can believe it, guests of honor at the banquet, if you get the drift. Meanwhile, the land party didn't have to contend with cannibals, although they still had to deal with floods, fevers, starvation, insects, alligators, snakes, jaguars, and whatever else the jungle could throw at them. The food situation was particularly dire since most of the supplies were aboard the ships, and Quesada had to threaten his men with the death penalty to stop them from killing and eating the horses. Oh well, at least they finally reached Tamalameque, which, as far as Quesada knew, was a friendly trading center. Except that it wasn't. 5 years earlier, a different expedition led by a German conquistador named Ambrosius Dalfinger left the town on not-so-friendly terms, so now the locals were hostile towards all European newcomers. Instead of finding safety, Quesada and his men had to fight for their lives. But military superiority was on their side, so they defeated the local tribe, rendezvoused with what was left of the river contingent, plundered Tamalamaki for supplies, and continued their journey for gold and glory. At this point in the story, some of you might be surprised to find out that the myth of El Dorado had a definite basis in reality, one which Quesada actually encountered in 1537. The Muisca Confederation. Living on a high plateau in the Andes Mountains called the Altiplano Cundiboyacense, the Muisca people concentrated around the city of Bochata, or modern-day Bogota, the capital and largest city in Colombia. More importantly, though, they were almost certainly the origin of the stories about the Gilded Man. Not only were the Muisca master craftsmen when it came to working with gold, but they also had a ceremony reminiscent of El Dorado. According to an account written by Juan Rodriguez Fraile in 1636, the Muisca leader would cover himself in gold dust, get in a raft, and paddle onto a sacred lake where he would throw gold objects into the water as offerings to the gods. The crucial difference, however, was that the real El Dorado did not do this every day, as stated by the myth, but only as part of his succession ceremony. At first, it looked like Quesada had struck gold, literally. It seemed as if the Muisca people lived up to the hype generated by the El Dorado legends. They definitely had plenty of gold, but they did not use it as currency. For them, the true value of gold was spiritual, and they combined it with copper to make an alloy called tumbaga, which they fashioned into various votive offerings for the gods. They also had salt and emerald mines that were ripe for plundering. Even though Quesada only had 180 men left by the time he made it up the Altiplano, he still had little difficulty in subduing the indigenous people using vastly superior firepower. So beginning in March 1573, the expedition spent the following year traveling from town to town, pillaging everything en route, culminating in the conquest of Bachata in 1538. Afterward, Quesada founded the city of Santa Fe de Bogota, which served as the capital of the new kingdom of Granada, the latest and greatest Spanish territory, which obviously would be governed by Quesada himself. The Muisca people had little to say in the matter. In fact, the main danger of Quesada's governorship was coming from inside the house because the same year, 2 other expeditions arrived in Bogota. After all, you didn't think that a tale as tantalizing as El Dorado would only attract one group of people, right? One expedition came from Venezuela and was led by German conquistador Nicolas Federman, while the third one traveled from Quito, headed by Sebastian de Belalcazar, one of Pizarro's former commanders. Even though Quesada was first, Finders Keepers rules were not in effect. Since he had no official commission to establish a new territory, he had exceeded his authority and was technically a mutineer. All 3 of them were, in fact, and for a while it looked like they were headed for a 3-way battle with the governorship up as the grand prize. However, cooler heads prevailed, and they decided the best course of action was to argue their case in front of King Charles V of Spain to make things official. As Fraile wrote, though minor rifts soon began to appear, the gold converted them into laughter. By 1540, the conquest of the Muisca Confederation was complete, and the tales of El Dorado had thoroughly captured the imagination of the Spanish conquistadors. However, reality often fails to live up to expectations. Sure, the Muisca people had lots of gold, but they were hardly swimming in it a la Scrooge McDuck. The Spanish had been promised a city of gold, and so far, no such Orient metropolis had presented itself. To a rational mind, this would suggest that the legend of El Dorado, both the king and the city, was simply that, a legend. It had been exaggerated by the people who told it. Maybe some details got lost in translation, or maybe, just maybe, since the people who shared these tales were often tortured for their information, they just told the murderous Spanish what they wanted to hear. However, by this point, the conquistadors were far from rational. Their vision had been completely blinded by the glitter of gold, so the only possible explanation was that they simply had not discovered it yet. El Dorado was still hidden somewhere in the deep, dark jungles of South America, waiting to be found. Unsurprisingly, the search for the true El Dorado resumed almost immediately, with no fewer than 3 expeditions setting off in 1541. The first was led by Gonzalo Pizarro, the younger half-brother of the more famous Francisco Pizarro. He set off in February of that year with 220 soldiers and around 4,000 indigenous people who had been recruited by force to act as porters and servants. According to chronicler Pedro Cieza de Leon, Pizarro was absolutely merciless when interrogating the locals. He had cane platforms built where the native people were tortured to death, set on fire, or torn to pieces by dogs if they refused to disclose the location of El Dorado. Just in case there were any lingering doubts about why so many South Americans kept telling the Spanish that El Dorado was real, this is what happened to those who told the truth. Eventually, the expedition found itself lost in the thick jungle, beset by heavy rains and short on food. Pizarro opted to scout ahead with 80 soldiers, leaving the bulk of his army behind under the command of Francisco de Orellana. He didn't find El Dorado, although he did run into a chieftain named Delicola, who had already heard of the savagery of the Spanish invaders. Wisely, he told Pizarro what he wanted to hear, that there was a wealthy region further on down the Napo River. Bolstered by this new development, Pizarro reunited with the rest of his army and pressed on, but the rainforest refused to show him any mercy. The food was almost gone. His men resorted to boiling their leather scabbards with herbs for sustenance. The native servants had all either died or run away. Pizarro decided to build a boat to sail faster down the river. The party was split in two again. Orellana loaded the boat with 60 men and all the heavy equipment and went on ahead in pursuit of food. Meanwhile, Pizarro and what was left of his expedition kept going overland on horseback. At least for a while. Eventually, they ate all the horses. Orellana had it pretty rough. A dozen of his men or so died from starvation or from eating poisonous plants. Eventually, they found a friendly tribe that took them in and fed them. At this point, Orellana was supposed to go back for Pizarro, but that never happened. Was this treachery? Did Orellana leave Pizarro to die so that he could claim the gold and the glory? Pizarro certainly thought so and accused Orellana of desertion. Against all odds, Pizarro did make it back to safety. Just when it looked like he would meet his end in the jungle, his men stumbled upon an abandoned manioc plantation, where they were able to gather their strength and collect enough food for the return journey. After over a year of arduous trekking through the jungle, Pizarro's party reached Quito in June 1542, nearly dead with hunger, naked and barefoot, covered with sores. As for Francisco de Orellana, he never discovered El Dorado, but found fame and immortality in a different way, by becoming the first European, possibly the first person, to sail the length of the Amazon River. According to him, he didn't betray Pizarro. The currents were simply too strong to sail upstream to meet him. His team waited for a month for the overland expedition to catch up, but they never did, so Orellana decided to build a newer, better boat and continue his journey. Eventually, he reached the end of the Napo River and entered the Amazon, and kept on going until he made it to the mouth of the river in August 1542. The second expedition to find El Dorado was led by Hernán Pérez de Quesada, the younger brother of the guy who conquered the Muisca. He set off in September 1541 with 260 soldiers and 200 horses and almost 6,000 native men, women, and children who were shackled and press-ganged into service. None of the enslaved locals made it back alive, as they were all sacrificed in the fervent and, frankly, deluded pursuit of a mythical city that they were never going to find. As were all the native tribes that were unfortunate enough to find themselves in Quesada's path, as they were all plundered for provisions and tortured for information. But for all the cruelties of Quesada and all the other conquistadors, there was one foe they could not submit: nature. The Amazon jungle proved to be as merciless to Quesada as it was to Pizarro. Hunger, fatigue, and illness plagued his expedition from the start, and ultimately, it was all for naught. Not only did he not locate El Dorado, obviously, but at the end of his journey, Quesada emerged in the valley of Sibundoy, in the district of the town of Pasto, belonging to Governor Belalcazar. That's right, all of Quesada's efforts had been in vain, as he had discovered a land that had already been discovered. Not only that, but it was under the control of one of his brother's political enemies. This was a complete debacle for Quesada, and his big brother had to write to the king to smooth things over. Quesada's one salvation was that during his trip, he stumbled upon groves of cinnamon trees, a spice that was of great value to the Spanish crown. The third, and by far the longest expedition that set off that year, was undertaken by German conquistador Philipp von Hutten. We've already mentioned a couple of Germans, and if you were wondering why they were involved in South America, it was because one of the richest families in Europe, the Welsers. They helped finance King Charles V of Spain, and in return, he gave them colonial rights to Venezuela, which they called Klein Venedig, aka Little Venice. Philipp von Hutten was acting in their interests as governor of Klein Venedig, and in fact, a member of the Welser clan, Bartholomeus VI, joined him on his trek exploring the jungles of South America. Obviously, von Hutten didn't find El Dorado either, but unlike the others, he thought that he did. After spending almost 3 years exploring the plains east of the Andes known as the Llanos, the German explorer reached the Promised Land. From this place, both the general and all the rest saw a town of disproportionate size, quite close. Although they were quite near, they could not see the far end of it. It was compact and well ordered, and in the middle was a house that greatly surpassed the rest in size and height. They asked the chief they had as a guide, whose house was that, so remarkable and eminent among the others? He answered that it was the house of the chief. He had some gold effigies or idols the size of boys, and a woman all made of gold who was their goddess. He and his subjects possessed other riches, but a short distance beyond, there were other chiefs who exceeded that one in the number of subjects and quantity of riches. Could von Hutten finally be in sight of the fabled El Dorado? Well, no. Not exactly. The land in front of him was certainly rich, far richer than any he previously encountered, but it was the land of the Omagua people, also known as the Kambeba. But gold is gold, after all, so naturally, as soon as von Hutten saw it, he wanted to conquer it. The Omagua, however, were no pushovers, and the German conquistadors didn't have enough men left to face such a strong foe. In fact, his first skirmish with the Omagua almost cost him his life after a warrior pierced his ribs with a spear. It was only thanks to a different friendly tribe that took him in and allowed him to convalesce that von Hutten made a recovery. Once he was back on his feet, he set course for Venezuela, determined to return with a new army and plunder this new land which he believed to be El Dorado. This was not to be, however. Although von Hutten reached Venezuela safely, once there he discovered that a Spanish conquistador named Juan de Carvajal had been appointed governor in his absence, and he had no desire to relinquish the position. A fight for power ensued, and eventually Carvajal captured both von Hutten and Bartholomeus Welser, and had them both beheaded in 1546. Following von Hutten's return, the scuttlebutt said that El Dorado lay hidden somewhere in the Omagua territory. You would think this would prompt a whole batch of new expeditions to get underway, but the conquistadors faced opposition from an unexpected source: King Charles V of Spain. Believe it or not, there were people back in the old country, such as Dominican friar Bartolomé de las Casas, who thought that conquistadors were too cruel with the indigenous people. They persuaded the king that there was a need for reform. So, in 1542, Charles passed the new laws to offer the native tribes some protection. Later in 1550, he went a step further and banned all conquest expeditions until the matter was sorted. Unsurprisingly, the new measures were not warmly received by the Spanish soldiers in South America. Some of them mutinied. Gonzalo Pizarro, the guy who commanded the first expedition we talked about, led a rebellion in Peru, but was eventually captured and beheaded for his efforts in 1548. The other conquistadors were more attached to their heads, so they decided to wait it out. In 1559, the royal ban was lifted, and almost immediately, the Viceroy of Peru gave permission for a new expedition to a conquistador named Pedro de Ursua to conquer the land of Omagua and Dorado, which shows us that the Spanish still thought that El Dorado was real and belonged to the Omagua people. This expedition, however, failed after the men mutinied under Ursua and killed him, choosing a new leader, a madman named Lope de Aguirre. You might be familiar with him if you saw the movie Aguirre, The Wrath of God by Werner Herzog, where he was portrayed by the equally insane Klaus Kinski. Anyway, Aguirre may have been unique among his ranks, as he was seemingly a conquistador who didn't care about El Dorado. Instead, he rebelled against the Spanish crown and was eventually betrayed and killed by his men. The 1560s saw 4 new expeditions set out to find El Dorado. The first one in 1566 was led by Captain Martin de Poveda and had no chronicler, so the details of his mission are unknown. 2 others left in 1568, commanded by Diego Fernandez de Serpa and Pedro Moravar de Silva, respectively. The first one ended in disaster when Serpa and most of his men were killed in an ambush by a native tribe, while the second one was plagued by mass desertions due to Maravar and De Silva's inept leadership. The fourth and final one in 1569 was commanded by none other than Gonzalo Jimenez de Quesada, the same man who conquered the Muisca Confederation and triggered this whole El Dorado madness. Almost 30 years had passed since then, but Quesada remained as steadfast as ever in his belief that El Dorado was real. Like the others, his expedition was a complete failure. After 3 years, he emerged from the jungle with almost his entire army and retinue of servants dead from starvation or illness. The royal report said that he has made no settlement and has achieved nothing, and yet Quesada wanted to do it again. The search for El Dorado had become a madness for some of the conquistadors, and they were willing to sacrifice anything and everything to achieve their goal. Ultimately, his other duties and failing health prevented Quesada from undertaking another expedition, although he ensured that his family carried on his fanatical endeavor. Quesada named his son-in-law, Antonio de Berrio, as his heir, with the stipulation that he continue the search for El Dorado. Fortunately for him, Berrio became just as obsessed with El Dorado, and during the 1580s and 1590s, he led 3 expeditions to find it, all washouts. After over half a century of searching without success, the enthusiasm for El Dorado began to wane, and oddly enough, the final major expeditions to look for the City of Gold were conducted not by the Spanish, but by the English, led by Walter Raleigh. Of course, he too failed, and his foolish pursuit cost him the life of his son and ultimately his own. If you want to learn that story in full, you can check out the bio we have available on Walter Raleigh. Instead of legend, we'll end with a real place that's as close to El Dorado as we're likely to ever get, Lake Guatavita, located in the Colombian Andes, northeast of Bogota. This lake was once on Muisca land before Quesada came along, and we're fairly certain that it was the sacred lake used during the crowning ceremony where the Muisca leader covered himself in gold dust, aka the story that started this whole hullabaloo. As early as 1545, the Spanish tried to drain the lake, as did many who came after them, and the gold they managed to recover on the lake's edges showed them that this was worth the effort. Armies, professional divers, contractors, consortiums, over the centuries they all had a go, and each time they found more gold, but only enough to frustrate them that they couldn't get to the bulk of the treasure, which many believe lies in the deep waters in the middle of the lake. But in 1965, the Colombian government named Lake Guatavita as part of the country's cultural heritage, and forbade any future draining, diving, or dragging. So the gold of El Dorado, if any truly still exists, remains out of reach. I hope you learned something today, and if you enjoyed this video, be sure to deploy your likes, comment a place to cover next, subscribe and ring that bell, and share this video with someone who loves learning about the most important places in history. I'm Eric Malachite, and we'll see you next time.